The government shutdown lasted 40 agonizing days, bringing America's economy and infrastructure to a standstill. Yet when the crisis finally broke, the resolution was not a principled compromise, but a total political surrender, a collapse rooted deep in legislative miscalculation. We are reporting on a historic reversal where the party that risked a national crisis for what many sources confirm were major corporate donor interests walked away with absolutely nothing. This cleared the path for the opposition to detonate a series of 5 aggressive, populist, domestic policy bombshells in a mere 48 hours. The question is stark, and it demands scrutiny. When political leaders hold the American people hostage, prioritizing financial backers over national stability, only to collapse utterly under pressure and unleash a wave of radical, direct-to-citizen policy, what does that say about the integrity and longevity of Washington's entire power structure? We uncover the full story of the seismic shift in American governance. Stay with us as we break this down in our in-depth discussion right here on News Focus Podcast. And if you find our reporting valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to support our channel. We truly appreciate it. So, the moment the administration steps back onto the domestic stage after the shutdown collapses, the entire political atmosphere in Washington feels like it changed. It went from defensive to aggressive, proactive. It was an earthquake. But before we even get into the policies themselves, we have to talk about the context. We have to establish the sheer magnitude of the political defeat that made all this possible. I mean, the longest government shutdown in American history.
It was an incredible 40 days. And you really can't overstate the severity of the miscalculation here. What started as a very confident power play, it was designed specifically to force the administration into expanding Obamacare subsidies, which protects the revenue of very specific insurance interests. That play turned into arguably one of the biggest political collapses for the opposition in decades. When you just look at the raw politics of it, this was so much more than a tactical retreat. It was a full-scale rout. And it left the architects of the shutdown just scrambling to explain what happened. The humiliation was palpable.
Let's detail that humiliation, because the goal was clear. Leverage public pain to force the administration's hand on a policy that was, let's be honest, highly contentious. But the length of it, the severity, it just backfired. The responsibility for the crisis shifted. How did that shift happen so decisively?
Well, it's a fascinating study in political pressure dynamics, really. The initial assumption, and you saw this echoed everywhere in the media at the time, was that the administrative branch would just get blamed for all the chaos.
That's the usual playbook.
Exactly. But the strategy failed because the real-world effects, they started biting hard and fast. It made the opposition's motivation look, well, purely transactional. We saw specific, tangible impacts that the average American just couldn't ignore.
Like what? What were the big ones?
Oh, the airports were in absolute chaos. Flights were delayed for days. Major international hubs were facing logistical nightmares. And then the economic numbers started coming in. Reports indicated that GDP was dropping at an annualized rate of 1.5%, all because of the paralysis.
1.5%. That is a massive hit.
It's a huge number. But crucially, I think the real tipping point was the threat to Thanksgiving travel. That's when it got personal for millions of people. When the public's basic ability to move, to see family when their economic certainty was threatened, the political cost just became instantly untenable for the people who started it.
So the political calculus was just wrong? They didn't account for how quickly the public would pinpoint the actual source of the pain, which, in this case, was the legislative branch refusing to do its job.
Precisely. And that external pressure created internal fractures, deep ones. Our source analysis points to a severe break within the opposition's own ranks.
This wasn't just a rumor, right? This was confirmed.
Oh, absolutely. The Axios report was, well, it was a bombshell. It confirmed that at least 10 Senate Democrats were on the verge of breaking away. They were ready to vote to end the crisis, regardless of the policy outcome.
10. That's a significant number. That's not just a crack in the wall. That's a major breach.
It completely destabilized the leverage they thought they had. The whole idea that the administration was isolated just crumbled. Even mainstream media analysts were forced to publish admissions like, quote, "the walls are closing in." It confirmed the administration's argument all along, that the opposition thought they could hold the country hostage for a policy that, at its root, benefited their big corporate donors. But they just fundamentally misread the public's appetite for these kinds of high-stakes political games.
And so when the end finally came, the terms of that surrender were, as you said, politically devastating. After 40 days of paralyzing the government, disrupting millions of lives, the opposition settled for one single concession. What was it?
A promise. That's the humiliating core of it. They settled for a promise. After all that economic damage, they secured a promise of a vote on their core demand expanding Obamacare subsidies sometime in December.
Not a guarantee of passage, not even a bill, just a vote.
Just the promise of a legislative debate down the road. It offered zero immediate policy gain. The president, of course, reflecting the mood of his base and sources in the White House, framed it immediately and very aggressively. He called it a total surrender and a historic reversal of power. And according to that narrative, the shutdown ended not because of some grand compromise, but because the American people had enough and the president. He called their bluff.
And this collapse, this complete strategic failure, is what sets the stage for this dramatic pivot we're seeing. We've been so accustomed to this administration being defined by foreign policy, Asia, global trade, the Middle East, and then suddenly he seizes this moment to refocus entirely on the home front.
It was a perfect strategic realignment. The message was explicit. I'm done playing defense. America first is back, and this time it's all about our economic independence. I mean, his public statement was no more foreign distractions. It is time to rebuild the home front. That signaled the administration believed they had, neutralized the immediate threat and secured the political capital they needed.
So that November 9th return wasn't just a reset.
No. Sources are calling it the rebirth of his entire domestic mission. It's a clear shift from reacting to crises to proactively dominating the domestic policy agenda. And the consequences for Washington, as we're seeing, have been instantaneous and, frankly, severe.
Which leads us directly into the core of our deep dive tonight, this domestic revolution, starting with the first major policy bombshell. This is a move that seems to directly address that public dissatisfaction we were just talking about, and it uses a really unusual funding mechanism, the $2,000 tariff dividend. This is, well, it's historic, not just the amount, but how it's financed.
It is absolutely historic. The administration announced that every non-wealthy American citizen will receive a $2,000 check. And what makes it so unprecedented is the funding mechanism you mentioned. It's funded exclusively by, and this is their phrase, trillions pouring in from reciprocal trade tariffs.
And this is the point that needs to be underlined, right? This is explicitly not financed by new taxes.
Correct. No new taxes on Americans, no budget cuts to other programs, and no printing money, which would incur more debt. The administration is framing this as revenue without taxation on the American citizen.
And they're calling this the first, America First dividend check in history. But let's get into the massive contradiction here. For decades, the Washington orthodoxy, from free trade economists to globalist think tanks, has told us tariffs are just dangerous taxes on consumers, that they trigger recessions.
And that's the narrative the administration is now aggressively trying to dismantle. They're citing the current economic proof, arguing that the establishment was just fundamentally wrong. The president's assertion that, quote, people that are against tariffs are fools now seems, in their view, to be backed by the numbers. They're pointing to factories reopening, the stock market hitting record highs, and crucially, this new trade income being funneled directly to citizens. It completely reframes tariffs not as a tax on you, but as a mechanism for, well, international wealth collection.
And we really need to grasp the economic rationale here, because calling this a dividend instead of a stimulus check is a very deliberate choice. The administration is framing this as a shareholder payout from the company called the United States of America.
That analogy is absolutely central to the whole doctrine. If it were stimulus, that would imply printing money, which often leads to the kind of inflationary pressures we've all been feeling recently.
Like you devaluing the dollar.
Exactly. But a dividend, in this context, suggests profits. Profits derived from successful operations, in this case, getting more favorable trade terms. This isn't the Fed cranking up the money supply. This is actual cash generated from global commerce flowing back to the populace. And in this framework, the populace are the true investors and owners of the country's economic success. For working-class families, this is being positioned not just as a financial benefit, but as a validation, a sign that the government is finally working for them, not just taxing them to fund other things.
Okay, let's get into the weeds on the funding mechanism a bit. Reciprocal tariffs.
Yeah.
What exactly does that mean, and how does it differ from a standard import tax that critics would say, rightly, is just a tax on the consumer?
That's where the nuance is, and it's a key distinction. Standard tariffs are often just blanket taxes on imports that can, and often do, get passed on to consumers. Reciprocal tariffs, as defined by this administration, are very specifically targeted. They're duties applied to nations that have high tariffs on specific American goods, like agricultural products or advanced manufacturing.
So it's about leveling the playing field.
The goal is negotiation and balance, yes. If a nation puts a 25% tariff on a U.S.-made car, the U.S. responds with an identical 25% tariff on a comparable import from that nation. Our sources indicate that this recent revenue surge is coming from successful negotiations where major trading partners are accepting new terms. And for the countries that refuse full free trade parity, the U.S. Treasury is now collecting significant sustained fees on that remaining trade flow.
And the revenue for that is what the administration claims is reaching trillions. Now, critics dispute that number and its sustainability. But the administration is using this stream not only for the dividend checks, but also to tackle the national debt. That's a move you don't often see from either party.
And this is the second layer of this fiscal doctrine, right alongside the dividend. The official announcement was very specific: future tariff surpluses. So any revenue beyond what's needed for the $2,000 checks will be directed straight to paying down the national debt.
Which is a staggering number, $37 trillion.
A mountain of red ink, yes. And this strategy, which they're calling fiscal sovereignty, uses that external trade leverage, not internal taxpayer pain, to reduce the debt.
So how does the administration justify this? I recall hearing a very specific financial argument, this concept of being over-levered versus under-levered. Can you break that down?
Right, that phrase is a key talking point and is borrowed directly from corporate finance. Critics will argue, look, the debt is $37 trillion, doesn't matter where the income comes from. But the administration's financial analysts are making a different case. They argue that the prior debt situation, say at $36 trillion, was over-levered because the country lacked a sufficient, independent, and reliable income stream outside of taxing its own citizens. Now they say, with the debt a bit higher at $37 trillion, but with this record, predictable revenue stream surging in from tariffs, the U.S. is actually under-levered.
So in corporate terms, they're saying the debt-to-income ratio has improved. They found a new source of revenue that isn't the American taxpayer, so the existing debt is more manageable.
That's the argument, precisely. They believe they've strengthened the national balance sheet by generating income from international commerce. But we have to introduce the critical perspective here. Skeptical economists argue this revenue stream is inherently volatile. It's dependent on the health of global trade, on political relations.
It's not guaranteed forever.
Exactly. They contend that making any significant dent in a $37 trillion debt is, well, statistically negligible in the short term. And they'd say this rhetoric is designed purely for political messaging, not as a serious long-term fiscal policy.
Which makes the reaction from the globalists, the champions of unrestricted free trade, even more understandable. If this money is going to debt paydown and citizen checks, it's not flowing into the international institutions they support.
They are reportedly furious, and that reaction really confirms the zero-sum nature of this policy. Every single dollar of tariff surplus used to pay down our national debt is a dollar that can't be spent overseas. It can't fund global initiatives championed by international bodies, and it can't flow through that complex web of NGOs and consulting groups that often benefit from those funds.
This is fiscal sovereignty in real time.
It is. Global trading partners and international regulatory bodies are realizing that these tariffs weren't just some temporary chaos. They were a long-term economic strategy designed to make the U.S. fiscally independent by collecting from other nations.
And finally, let's turn to Wall Street. They were some of the most vocal critics when the trade war talk first began. Now we're seeing what's being called the Trump effect 2.0.
The initial skepticism has been almost completely replaced by calculated profit-seeking. The markets roared right after the dividend announcement. The Dow smashed its previous high. Stocks jumped across the board.
Especially consumer spending sectors, I'd imagine.
Oh, yes. Immediate spikes there. Wall Street analysts, who were once very hostile to this, are now treating this specific type of tariff income like dividends. They recognize this is cash flowing directly to consumers. We're even hearing financial traders call the expected influx of cash a liquidity wave, because those $2,000 checks will immediately increase consumer buying power and, just as importantly, financial optimism. The administration's core argument that the old system of American labor generating wealth while the government wasted it was the real unsustainable model is gaining traction, even among investors who are just following the money.
So we go from cash in hand to a fundamental reform of the American dream itself. And that brings us to bombshell number 2, the 50-year FHA mortgage, which directly attacks the generational homeownership crisis.
This policy is aimed at what is, frankly, a profound societal failure. For the last couple of decades, we've just watched as millennials and Gen Z got systematically locked out of the housing market.
Buried under student debt, facing insane rent hikes.
Exactly. a sense of perpetual dependency. And it's been made worse by these large corporate entities buying up entire neighborhoods just for rental yield. The administration's move here is intended to be an immediate structural lifeline.
The directive went to the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, to roll out a 50-year fixed-rate mortgage. What's the core principle driving this?
It's highly populist and very simple. If you can afford rent, you should be able to afford to own. The FHA typically deals with mortgages for lower and moderate income borrowers, often first-time buyers. Extending the term from the traditional 30 years all the way out to 50 is a revolutionary change. It's designed purely to manipulate the single biggest barrier to entry, which is the monthly payment.
Okay, let's do a deep dive on the mechanics of this. How does extending the term to 50 years lower the monthly payment so dramatically? What are the implications for amortization?
It's pure amortization math, which is also the critics' primary target. So let's take a typical $400,000 loan at a standard, say, 7% interest rate. On a 30-year term, your monthly principal and interest payment is around $2,660.
Okay.
Now, if you extend that same loan to 50 years, the payment drops to about $2,330. That's a difference of over $300 a month. For a working family, that is significant breathing room. It can make homeownership possible where it just wasn't before.
But this brings us right to the controversy. Critics, including those on CNN, immediately mock this. I think the quote was, "You'll die before you pay it off." They argue that the total amount of interest paid just skyrockets.
And that is the necessary and immediate counter-argument we have to analyze, because mathematically, the critics are correct. On that same $400,000 loan at 7%, the total interest paid over 30 years is about $557,000.
Which is already a lot.
It is. But over 50 years, the total interest explodes to over $995,000, nearly $1 million in interest alone. This is what critics are pointing to when they call it predatory lending disguised as affordability.
So how does the administration and its supporters defend a policy that could potentially double the overall cost of the house for the borrower?
Their defense focuses entirely on present-day access and building equity, not on long-term cost efficiency. The president's retort to the critics, "At least you'll own something before you do." That's central to the whole message. Supporters argue that for millions of people trapped paying rent to a corporation with zero equity benefit, this provides two immediate, non-negotiable benefits.
Okay, what are they?
First, a guaranteed fixed payment. It protects them on the inflationary rent hikes that are crippling so many. And second, the instant ability to start building equity, however slowly, that can be passed down to the next generation. It's positioned as a generational reset, aimed at the forgotten American who just needs a foot in the door right now.
That makes sense from a stability and access point of view. But there's a crucial detail about the mortgage mechanism itself that kind of undermines the critics' life sentence argument, isn't there?
Yes, and this detail is often overlooked in the debate. The 50-year term simply sets the maximum payment schedule. It does not lock you in for half a century. Because the required monthly payments are so much lower, borrowers have far greater flexibility to make accelerated payments.
So you could double up on payments when you get a bonus or a tax refund?
Or the $2,000 tariff dividend, for instance.
Yeah.
Exactly. This flexibility allows people to pay the mortgage off way, way earlier than 50 years, while still having the security of that lower maximum payment if times get tough. It provides an off-ramp that the critics rarely acknowledge.
What about the regulatory side? For the lenders, did the FHA need to do a significant overhaul to even greenlight a term this long? What are the default risks?
The regulatory overhaul was significant, yes. It required a reinterpretation of long-standing FHA guidelines on default thresholds and borrower qualifications. Traditional models assume higher risk with longer terms because, well, life happens, job loss, health crises. They're more likely to occur over 50 years.
Sure.
But the administration counters this by saying the lower monthly payment itself reduces the immediate stress on a borrower's budget, so it actually lowers the statistical likelihood of default in those first few critical years. Lenders were naturally skeptical, but since it's an FHA loan, the government backing mitigates their direct risk. The broader economic aim, which you can see becoming the cornerstone of the 2026 message, is to make America affordable again, and housing is where people feel that pain the most.
All right, so we have cash in hand with the tariff dividend, a pathway to ownership with the 50-year mortgage. The third policy bombshell addresses the healthcare crisis. And again, it involves redirecting billions of dollars away from corporations and toward the American people, a fundamental dismantling of the existing structure.
This is perhaps the most politically aggressive of the three policies. It strikes right at the heart of the lobbying complex that, according to the administration, fueled the shutdown in the first place. The strategy isn't just repeal and replace, which was the old slogan. The new mantra is redirect and empower. The administration is fundamentally changing where the money goes. Instead of billions in government subsidies flowing directly to large insurance giants to cover specific policy mandates, those dollars are now slated to go straight into the hands of the American people.
The administration's post on True Social was pretty clear, all caps. Pay the people, not the insurance companies. What specific funds are we talking about here? What's the exact mechanism of this redirection?
We need to get specific because it's important. Under the Affordable Care Act, the government sends huge amounts of money to insurers. It's done through things like the advanced premium tax credits, APTCs, and previously cost-sharing reductions. These funds are meant to keep premiums affordable, but they flow directly into the corporate coffers of the insurance companies. The new strategy is to convert those subsidy streams into a universal, defined contribution voucher or an expanded tax credit system.
So instead of the money going to United Health to cover patient A's premium gap, patient A gets that same amount of money directly.
Precisely. Patient A receives a cash equivalent, a tax credit, or a voucher, and then uses that money to buy the coverage they actually want. Whether that's a high-deductible catastrophic plan or a plan that covers holistic care, it's their choice. The administration argues this immediately restores choice and competition. The insurance company now has to compete for the individual's dollar rather than just cashing a government check regardless of service quality.
And there's data to back up the administration's argument that the previous structure made insurers incredibly rich, right? Can you detail that profit spike since the ACA launched?
The numbers are staggering, and this is the evidence the administration leans on heavily. Since the Affordable Care Act was implemented, United Health stock is up over 1,200%.
1,200%.
Yes. Anthem, another major player, is up 400%. Molina, which specializes in government programs, is up 900%. The conclusion from administration analysts is simple. The so-called Affordable Care Act fundamentally failed to make care cheaper. What it did succeed at was the massive enrichment of the financial middlemen, the insurance conglomerates who benefited from guaranteed subsidized revenue.
And that data, of course, feeds directly back into the political motivation they cited for the shutdown.
It connects all the dots. That quote from Senator Barrasso, that the opposition leader shut down the government for his donors. It gains immense credibility when you look at these profit numbers. So this policy shift is a deliberate attempt to sever that political donor connection. Redirect the money away from the corporate giants directly to the citizens. If the money doesn't flow to the insurance companies, they have less financial incentive to lobby for the old structure.
The proposal, then, is all about shifting power from Washington dictation to individual empowerment.
Correct. Americans get the cash, and with it, they gain the freedom to decide their plan, their provider, and the level of coverage they genuinely need. They're free from government mandates for things they may not want or need. It's pitched as eliminating the middlemen, the fat cats. And while to the average citizen, this just sounds like common sense, let people control the money meant for their care to the establishment, it's radical.
Yeah.
Washington is no longer dictating the terms of coverage, which is why the D.C. elites are, frankly, terrified. They lose control, they lose leverage, and they lose the ability to influence billions in corporate profits.
But critics are immediately raising some serious concerns. If you eliminate the mandate and redirect the cash, what happens to high-risk pools? What about protections for pre-existing conditions that the ACA guaranteed?
That is the essential counterargument, and one we have to analyze impartially. It's a valid concern. Opponents argue that converting to a pure defined contribution system will lead to something called adverse selection.
Meaning healthier people will take the cheap plans, and sicker people will be left behind.
Essentially, yes. Healthier individuals will take the cash credit and buy cheaper high-deductible plans. That leaves the sicker, higher-cost individuals isolated in expensive pools, causing their premiums to spike. The administration counters this by saying the new system will include risk mitigation measures, possibly using state-level high-risk pools or reinsurance to stabilize markets. But the specific details on how they will legally replace the ACA's consumer protections, that remains the biggest anticipated legal hurdle they face. All right, let's pull back and synthesize these three policies: the tariff dividends, the 50-year mortgages, the healthcare redirection. This is clearly not just a random set of actions. This is the emergence of a unified policy doctrine after that shutdown collapse. Absolutely. This is the doctrine of America First for real this time. It's an internally focused, economically empowering national strategy. This is the evolved 2025 administration, and it's fundamentally focused on turning foreign policy leverage, the successful collection of tariffs revenue, into direct, tangible economic power for American citizens. The principle is unwavering. American wealth belongs to American citizens.
So the core thesis is national restoration, moving away from global redistribution.
Exactly. For decades, the political establishment in Washington profited off American paychecks and labor, often redirecting those funds internationally or to corporate allies. The administration's current message is that the global gravy train is over. The people get paid first, and the nation rebuilds its core economic strength by prioritizing homeownership, direct cash flow, and healthcare choice. Every single one of these policies reinforces that central principle of economic sovereignty.
And the global reaction seems to confirm this analysis. Foreign governments, from Beijing to Brussels, who relied on the old system's predictability, are now reportedly scrambling.
Their concern is palpable because the leverage has fundamentally shifted. The U.S. is now demanding respect and reciprocity, not begging for trade deals. The old political order thrived on interdependence and financial complexity. This new doctrine runs on simplicity and independence. For millions of American voters, these policies represent the first concrete taste of economic freedom in decades. They are directly receiving funds rather than watching taxes leave their accounts and just disappear into opaque global or corporate subsidy systems.
Let's talk about the inevitable establishment meltdown that followed these rapid-fire announcements. After 40 days of confidence, of gloating over the shutdown, the opposition woke up to find their entire narrative not just challenged, but decimated.
The panic was striking. The media's prior narrative of a politically isolated administration just completely collapsed.
Yeah.
We saw subtle but significant admissions. Axios, for instance, quietly ran an analysis admitting that Democrats had overplayed their hand.
Right. They bet too aggressively on the shutdown.
Exactly. And maybe most telling, the New York Times, while covering the policy rollouts, described the result of this political reversal. The fact that the opposition's failure led to these populist policies. They described it as regrettable.
Regrettable? That's an interesting choice of words.
Isn't it? Regrettable that their political strategy ended in total collapse and led to policies that directly benefit citizens. It reveals a profound cognitive dissonance within the establishment.
And the hypocrisy around the tariffs was just rampant. Pundits who spent months, years attacking the tariff strategy, labeling them strictly as taxes on consumers, suddenly had to cover the story of millions of citizens receiving $2,000 checks explicitly funded by those same tariffs.
It exposed a massive disconnect between DC economic theory and the palpable economic reality for the average American. They swore the tariffs would crash the economy. Yet every press conference, every policy rollout, every soaring stock market report is a reminder that this shift toward economic nationalism is yielding direct financial benefits. This isn't just political theater anymore. It's cash in hand, a path to ownership, and proof that this evolved, domestic-focused doctrine is resonating economically.
But as you said, entrenched systems don't just surrender. If these policies represent a domestic revolution, what does the road ahead look like? What kind of obstruction should we anticipate?
We have to anticipate a fierce, relentless, and sustained battle. The administration views every one of these policy launches as part of a mission to finish the job before the 2026 midterms. They know that if the opposition regains legislative control, these policies will be the first on the chopping block. So we expect nonstop obstruction through legal challenges, bureaucratic delays, and legislative maneuvers.
What are the specific pressure points they'll target? Where are the attacks going to come from?
Well, sources close to the legislative opposition indicate immediate legal challenges to the tariff dividends funding mechanism.
Yeah.
They'll likely argue the executive branch doesn't have the authority to appropriate that money directly to citizens without explicit congressional approval. Second, they'll attack the 50-year mortgage, challenging the FHA's authority to create such a long-term loan, saying it violates sound fiscal practice.
And healthcare.
And above all, the massive insurance and pharmaceutical lobbies will fight tooth and nail to prevent the healthcare redirection.
Yeah.
They will challenge the shift from mandatory subsidies to optional vouchers, all in the name of protecting their corporate allies.
So it sounds like the entire political and legal focus of the opposition will be aimed at one thing: preventing the public from feeling the direct economic benefits of these new policies.
That is the consensus strategy. Delay, obfuscate, and legally challenge until after the next election. If the policies are successfully delayed, the citizens don't get the cash or the housing access, and the narrative of economic renewal fails. But the political environment is hardening. Despite this anticipated fight, the administration's approval numbers are climbing. Independent voters, who are often the most cynical and focused on kitchen table issues, are responding. Their sentiment, captured in focus groups, is simple but powerful. If my bank account is growing and I have a shot at a home, then the government must be doing something right.
The next phase of this domestic revolution is going to be decisive then. Do Americans sustain this new model fueled by trade leverage and reinvestment, or do they hand control back to the establishment that many argue caused the longest shutdown in history?
The administration is placing a massive bet that the American people will choose their own immediate financial benefit over the warnings of the established political class. And if the market reactions and the climbing approval numbers are any indication, the people are responding strongly to this new doctrine of national restoration. For the first time in modern history, the sources of power in Washington seem to be paying the people rather than being paid by them. Thank you. And thank you to our listeners for joining this crucial deep dive into the massive pivot in domestic policy. The central theme that ties these seemingly disparate policies together is the shift from the old system characterized by government waste, corporate dependency, and global redistribution to a new system rooted in national restoration, direct economic reinvestment, and rewarding the American citizen.
That's all for this episode of News Focus Podcast. But it leaves us with one haunting question. If the guardians of the rules are the first to break them, who is left to protect the game?